Pedro Rodriguez Filo was born with a dented skull. The injury was inflicted by a particularly violent father who had tragically beaten Filo's mother while she was pregnant with him. In the spectrum of nature versus nurture, Pedro seemed to get violent tendencies from both sides of the equation. And it was these acts of violence that ended up playing a starring role in Pedro's life, as he eventually became one of the 20th century's most prolific serial killers. Why am I starting a book that's supposedly about increasing long-term well-being with a story of a man who turned into a real-life Dexter? Here's the answer. The person Pedro is now, as you'll see, is very different from the one he once was. And the arc of his life raises a key question. What determines who we become? Put another way, how do we ensure that our future self is the person our present self wants them to be? It's a question that applies not just to extreme cases like Pedro's, but to the rest of our lives as well. A past you wouldn't want. In 1966, when he was 13, Pedro was beaten up by an older cousin. He was small for his age, and losing a fight to his relative caused the rest of his family and neighborhood kids to laugh at him. Bent on revenge, he waited until both he and his cousin were working at their grandfather's factory before he pushed his older relative into a sugarcane press. The press severely mangled his cousin's arm and shoulder, but spared his life. A year later, Pedro Sr. was fired from his job as a school security guard for allegedly stealing from the school store. Although he swore the daytime guard had committed the thefts, he was fired just the same. According to his autobiography, Pedro couldn't bear the thought of his father being falsely accused, gathered guns and knives from his family's house, and left for a 30-day trip in the woods, where he hunted for food and thought about retribution. Returning to town, he sought out the man who had fired his father, the town's deputy mayor, and shot and killed him. Still consumed with rage about his father's unjust treatment, he tracked down the daytime guard, shot him twice, covered the body with furniture and boxes, and set it on fire. But these were just the first of what would come to be many episodes of brutal violence. And by the time he was 18, Pedro had earned himself the nickname Pedro Matador, or Killer Petey. He tattooed "I kill for pleasure" on his right forearm, and his late fiancée's name alongside the phrase "I can kill for love" on his left arm. Once he was finally caught by law enforcement, he was charged with 18 murders and ordered to a notoriously brutal Sao Paulo prison. For the transfer from jail to prison, he was put in the back of a police car with a serial rapist. The serial rapist did not survive the trip. By 1985, Pedro had killed 71 people, one of whom was his own father, and his prison sentence was increased to 400 years. But the killing still didn't stop. While he was locked up, he was responsible for murdering an additional 47 inmates, though he claims it was more than 100. This doesn't excuse his violence, of course, but it does speak to his murderous talents. These prison victims represented some of society's worst criminals. When Pedro wasn't killing other prisoners, he took up a rigorous exercise program, learned to read and write, and started receiving and answering fan mail. In the early 2000s, the Brazilian authorities realized that they had a problem, and it wasn't that Killer Petey was systematically thinning out the prison population. Instead, they noticed that the Brazilian Penal Code was created when life expectancy in Brazil was 43 years. According to the code, inmates were not to be detained for a period longer than 30 years. Fearing the release of one of the country's most notorious criminals, judges found a legal loophole. Prisoners could receive extended sentences for crimes committed after the original ones were prosecuted. Pedro, however, appealed his additional punishment and won, which is how, in April 2007, after 34 years behind bars, only 4 more than the current maximum, he was released.